December 15th, 1942. The ruins of Stalingrad. In a basement that was once someone's kitchen, a German soldier named Heinrich Mueller crouches over a scrap of paper torn from a propaganda leaflet. The temperature is -30 degrees Celsius. His fingers are so numb he can barely hold the pencil stub. But he writes anyway, because he knows these might be his last words to the woman who gave him life. Dearest mother, we are eating horses now. The meat is tough and tastes like leather, but we fight over every scrap. Yesterday Klaus found a dead rat and we cooked it over a candle flame. Tasted better than anything I can remember. Soon we'll be eating each other. I can see it in some men's eyes already. The letter was never sent. For 79 years, it remained buried in Soviet archives, classified as evidence of enemy morale degradation. Its discovery in 2021 by German historian Dr. Andreas Weber would shatter comfortable myths about the Wehrmacht's last stand at Stalingrad and force the world to confront one of warfare's most taboo subjects: how civilized men become animals when civilization abandons them. This is not a story about military strategy or heroic sacrifice. This is a story about hunger so complete it consumes not just the body but the soul. It's about how quickly human beings can fall from the pinnacle of technological warfare to the most primitive form of survival. It's about the letter that German censors tried to destroy because it told a truth too terrible for the homeland to hear. Don't let this story disappear. Subscribe to keep these memories alive. Heinrich Mueller's letter begins with an attempt at normalcy that makes its contents even more disturbing. He asks about his mother's health, mentions that he hopes his father's arthritis isn't bothering him in the cold, wonders if his sister Maria has finished her studies. These mundane family concerns, written by a man slowly starving to death in the ruins of a foreign city, create a cognitive dissonance that runs throughout the entire document. I hope you received my last letter, he writes, though both he and his mother would have known that no mail had left the Stalingrad pocket for weeks. I told you about our winter quarters and how we were preparing for a comfortable season. I'm afraid I may have been too optimistic. Our situation has changed somewhat since then. The understatement is heartbreaking. By December 1942, the German Sixth Army was completely surrounded by Soviet forces, cut off from all supply lines, slowly freezing and starving in temperatures that regularly dropped below -40 degrees. Changed somewhat was Heinrich's way of describing conditions that would soon reduce proud German soldiers to scavenging corpses for scraps of flesh. The letter's power lies in its gradual revelation of these horrors through the mundane details that Heinrich chooses to share. He doesn't begin with dramatic descriptions of battle or death. Instead, he focuses on food or the absence of it, in ways that reveal the complete breakdown of normal military organization and human behavior. Our daily bread ration has been reduced again, he writes. We now receive 50 grams per day, about 2 thin slices. The bread is made mostly from sawdust and potato peels, but we treasure it like gold. Some men save their entire daily portion and eat it all at once. Others try to make it last by eating crumb by crumb throughout the day. I've tried both methods. Neither satisfies the emptiness inside. Soviet intelligence reports, declassified in 1991, confirm Heinrich's observations about the collapse of German supply lines. By mid-December 1942, the Luftwaffe was delivering an average of 30 tons of supplies per day to the besieged Sixth Army, far below the 300 tons needed to maintain basic combat effectiveness. Most of these supplies consisted of ammunition rather than food, as German command still harbored hopes of breaking out of the encirclement through military action. The consequences of this supply failure appear throughout Heinrich's letter in details that become increasingly disturbing. We've eaten all the horses in our sector, he writes. Even the officers' mounts have been slaughtered and divided among the companies. The meat was stringy and tough, but it was still meat. Now we're down to leather, belts, boots, anything we can boil soft enough to chew. Yesterday I saw a man trying to eat his own gloves. German military records from the Stalingrad pocket, captured by Soviet forces and examined by historians decades later, reveal the systematic breakdown of military discipline as starvation took hold. Unit commanders reported increasing incidents of theft, hoarding, and violence over food. Men who had served together for years began stealing from each other's meager rations. Some resorted to eating leather goods, paper, and even their own clothing in desperate attempts to fill their stomachs. Heinrich's letter documents this descent from military order to desperate survival with the observational skills of a man who understands he is witnessing the collapse of civilization. The company kitchen still operates on schedule, he writes, but there's nothing to cook. Sergeant Weber still calls the men to mess formation twice a day. We line up with our metal cups and bowls, just as we always have. But now we're served hot water with perhaps a few cabbage leaves floating in it. The men still say, "Thank you, Sergeant," when he ladles the water into their cups. Habits die harder than men, it seems. The psychological dimensions of extreme hunger emerge throughout Heinrich's observations. Starvation doesn't just affect the body, it fundamentally alters personality, judgment, and moral reasoning. Men who had been reliable soldiers and decent human beings began exhibiting behaviors that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Klaus has been acting strangely, Heinrich writes about his longtime friend and fellow soldier. He hoards anything that might be edible, tree bark, paper, even cigarette filters. He hides these things in his coat and whispers to them like secrets. Yesterday I caught him licking the inside of an empty tin can that had contained meat 6 weeks ago. When he saw me watching, he offered to share. The can was completely empty, but he insisted there was still flavor in the metal. Modern medical research on starvation confirms many of the behaviors Heinrich describes. Prolonged caloric deprivation causes significant changes in brain chemistry and cognitive function. Obsessive thoughts about food dominate consciousness, while decision-making abilities deteriorate. People experiencing severe malnutrition often develop hoarding behaviors, engage in magical thinking about food sources, and lose the ability to accurately assess their situation. Dr. Sarah Chun, a nutritionist who has studied famine conditions, explains, Heinrich's descriptions match what we know about advanced starvation syndrome. When the body begins consuming its own muscle tissue for energy, brain function becomes impaired. People lose the ability to think rationally about food and survival. What Heinrich was witnessing was the literal breakdown of human consciousness under extreme duress. Heinrich's letter reveals his own struggle to maintain mental coherence, as hunger increasingly dominates his thoughts and perceptions. I dream about food every night now, he writes. Not fancy meals or restaurant dinners, but simple things, a thick slice of bread with butter, a bowl of potato soup, an apple. I wake up thinking I can smell these foods, but it's just the smell of corpses and smoke. Sometimes I can't tell the difference between sleeping and waking anymore. The hunger dreams feel more real than this frozen hell we're living in. The letter's most disturbing passages describe the breakdown of taboos around human flesh that would eventually lead to documented cases of cannibalism among German forces at Stalingrad. Heinrich approaches this subject with a horror that reveals his understanding of the moral boundaries being crossed. Something terrible happened yesterday, he writes. I found Weber cutting meat from the body of a dead Russian soldier. He said it was just like any other meat, that dead flesh was dead flesh regardless of where it came from. He offered me some, and God help me, I was tempted. I walked away, but I could smell it cooking later. It smelled like pork. Several men from the company shared Weber's meal. They said nothing while they ate, just stared at the ground and chewed mechanically. Soviet war crimes investigators documented numerous instances of cannibalism among German troops during the siege of Stalingrad, though these reports remained classified for decades due to their sensitivity. Interviews with Soviet prisoners who had been held by German forces revealed systematic scavenging of corpses for edible flesh, beginning with enemy dead and eventually extending to German casualties. A classified NKVD report from January 1943 states, enemy forces have been observed removing flesh from corpses using bayonets and eating the raw meat immediately. In several instances, German soldiers have been captured with human meat in their possession. Interrogation reveals that such practices have become common among enemy units facing prolonged food shortages. Heinrich's letter provides rare testimony about how individual soldiers processed their participation in or proximity to such acts. Unlike official reports that treated cannibalism as a tactical intelligence matter, His words reveal the psychological horror experienced by men forced to confront the collapse of their own humanity. I understand now why ancient peoples feared winter so much, he writes. It's not just the cold that kills. It's what the cold makes you become. I look at my hands and they're like claws now, always grasping for something to eat. I look at other men and sometimes I find myself wondering what they would taste like. These thoughts come without my permission, and I can't make them stop. Is this still me? Or have I become something else entirely? The existential crisis Heinrich describes reflects the profound psychological damage caused by extreme survival conditions. Starvation forces people to confront aspects of human nature that are normally suppressed by civilization and adequate nutrition. The boundary between acceptable and unacceptable behavior dissolves when basic survival needs overwhelm moral reasoning. Heinrich's letter documents his desperate attempts to maintain his human identity, even as his body and mind deteriorated under the pressure of prolonged malnutrition. I try to remember who I was before this war, he writes. I was a bank clerk in Munich. I wore clean suits and helped people with their financial problems. I went to church on Sundays and sent flowers to girls I wanted to court. That person seems like someone I read about in a book, not someone I actually was. How do you get back to being human after you've forgotten how? The question reflects the permanent psychological damage that extreme survival situations can inflict. Even survivors of severe malnutrition often struggle to readjust to normal life, haunted by memories of thoughts and behaviors that violated their fundamental sense of identity. Heinrich's observations about his fellow soldiers reveal the various ways individuals responded to extreme deprivation. Some maintained rigid adherence to military protocols even when such protocols had become meaningless. Others abandoned all pretense of discipline and focused solely on immediate survival. A few seemed to find meaning in their suffering by interpreting it through religious or ideological frameworks. Lieutenant Hoffman still shaves every morning, Heinrich writes. He uses melted snow for water and a knife blade for a razor, scraping away whiskers that barely exist because we're all so thin and weak. He says maintaining standards is what separates soldiers from animals. But I've seen him searching through garbage for scraps of food like the rest of us. I don't know if his shaving makes him more human or if it just makes his degradation more visible. The letter reveals Heinrich's growing awareness that the German position at Stalingrad was hopeless, despite official propaganda that continued to promise relief and eventual victory. This knowledge added psychological despair to physical suffering, creating a double burden that many soldiers found unbearable. The radio still broadcasts messages from the fatherland about our glorious defense of European civilization, he writes. The announcers speak about our sacrifice with voices full of pride and confidence. But they've never smelled what we smell, never felt this cold, never gone to sleep wondering if they'll wake up human or animal. They talk about glory while we fight over frozen scraps like dogs. I wonder if they would use the same words if they could see us now. Heinrich's criticism of official propaganda reflects a broader disillusionment that appears throughout his letter. The gap between ideological justifications for the war and the reality of starvation created cognitive dissonance that forced many soldiers to question everything they had been taught about their mission and purpose. Support this work so the truth can continue to be heard. The letter's tone becomes increasingly desperate as Heinrich apparently realizes that his situation will not improve. His handwriting becomes less controlled, his sentences shorter and more fragmented. The change in style suggests deteriorating physical condition as well as mounting psychological pressure. My hands shake so much now I can barely write, he admits. Not just from the cold, but from weakness. I've lost so much weight that my uniform hangs on me like a scarecrow's clothes. When I look in broken mirrors, I see a stranger's face. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, skin stretched tight over skull bones. Is this what dying looks like? Is this how life leaves the body? 1 gram at a time. Heinrich's physical deterioration mirrors the broader collapse of the German Sixth Army, which by late December 1942 had ceased to function as an effective military force. Soviet intelligence estimated that German combat strength had fallen to less than 20% of authorized levels, with most units unable to mount coherent offensive or defensive operations. The letter provides insight into how individual soldiers experienced this military disintegration. Rather than sudden defeat in battle, Heinrich describes a gradual erosion of capability and morale that left men alive but no longer able to function as soldiers. "We still receive orders from headquarters," he writes. "Yesterday we were told to prepare for an offensive operation to break through Soviet lines. The officers read these orders with straight faces, as if we were still the army that conquered France and drove toward Moscow. But look at us, we can barely stand up, much less attack enemy positions. Some men laughed when they heard the orders. Others just stared. I think we're beyond caring about military operations now. We just want to survive another day." The disconnect between official expectations and battlefield reality creates dark humor throughout Heinrich's letter. His observations reveal how soldiers used irony and gallows humor to cope with situations that had become too absurd for normal emotional responses. "They've promoted me to sergeant," he writes, "not because I showed leadership or tactical skill, but because the previous sergeant died and someone needed to keep the paperwork organized. I now command 8 men, though 3 of them haven't been seen for days and might be dead. My sergeant's stripes are sewn onto a uniform jacket that belongs to someone else, a dead someone. It feels like playing dress-up in a morgue." Heinrich's promotion reflects the wholesale collapse of military hierarchy that occurred as casualties mounted and replacement personnel became unavailable. Traditional command structures gave way to informal arrangements based on whoever remained alive and functional rather than rank or experience. The letter documents how this breakdown of authority affected military discipline and unit cohesion. Without effective leadership and clear command structures, individual soldiers were forced to make survival decisions that often conflicted with military objectives. "Nobody follows orders anymore," Heinrich writes. "Not because we're mutinous, but because the orders don't make sense. Yesterday Lieutenant Hoffman ordered us to establish a defensive perimeter around a building that had already been destroyed by artillery. We went through the motions because it gave us something to do, but we all knew it was meaningless. We're just pretending to be soldiers now, the way children pretend to be adults." The comparison to children's games appears repeatedly in Heinrich's letter, suggesting his awareness that military activities had become elaborate forms of make-believe disconnected from any practical purpose. This recognition of absurdity seems to have provided some psychological relief from the horror of his situation. Heinrich's letter also reveals the emergence of informal survival networks that replaced official military organization. Soldiers formed small groups based on friendship, shared resources, and mutual protection rather than formal command relationships. "Klaus and I have agreed to share everything we find. Food, fuel, warm clothing, anything useful," he writes. Werner and Schmidt have a similar arrangement. "These partnerships are more important than company organization now. Your survival partner is the person who might save your life or end it, depending on how desperate things become. I trust Klaus, but I also watch him carefully. Hunger can change anyone." The tension between cooperation and competition that Heinrich describes reflects fundamental challenges of survival in extreme scarcity. While mutual aid increased everyone's chances of survival, it also created opportunities for betrayal that could be fatal under such desperate circumstances. Heinrich's letter provides rare documentation of how soldiers navigated these moral complexities. His relationship with Klaus illustrates both the necessity and the fragility of trust in survival situations. "Klaus found a piece of frozen bread yesterday," he writes. "It was small, maybe 30 grams, but it was real bread, not the sawdust mixture we usually get. He could have eaten it himself and I never would have known. Instead, he broke it in half and shared it with me. Such a small thing, but it felt like the most generous act I've ever witnessed. I wanted to cry, but my eyes were too dry from dehydration." These moments of humanity amid degradation provide emotional anchors throughout Heinrich's letter. His ability to recognize and appreciate kindness suggests that starvation had not completely destroyed his capacity for moral reasoning, even as it forced him to contemplate previously unthinkable acts. The letter's religious content reveals Heinrich's struggle to maintain faith in divine providence while experiencing conditions that seem to negate any belief in cosmic justice or meaning. His references to God become increasingly complex and ambivalent as his situation deteriorates. "I still pray every night," he writes. But I'm not sure what I'm praying for anymore. I used to ask God to keep me safe and let me return home. Now I pray for death to come quickly if it's going to come, and for forgiveness if I have to do things that good Christians shouldn't do. I wonder if God can hear prayers from this frozen hell, or if he's decided that we've moved beyond his concern. Heinrich's theological uncertainty reflects broader questions about how faith traditions respond to extreme suffering and moral compromise. His letter suggests that traditional religious frameworks provided little practical guidance for survival decisions that involved choosing between different forms of moral degradation. The document reveals Heinrich's growing preoccupation with death and his attempts to prepare psychologically for various ways his life might end. Unlike soldiers in normal combat situations who face sudden death from enemy action, Heinrich confronted the prospect of slow death from starvation, disease, or freezing, forms of dying that allowed time for reflection and dread. I think about death constantly now, he writes, not in a morbid way but practically. Will I freeze first or starve first? Will enemy soldiers find me and end it quickly? Or will I just fade away gradually like so many others? I've seen both kinds of death here, and I'm not sure which is preferable. At least battle death has some dignity to it. Starvation just reduces you to nothing, piece by piece. Heinrich's clinical analysis of his mortality options reveals the psychological adaptation required to function while facing certain death. His matter-of-fact tone suggests that prolonged exposure to extreme danger had partially desensitized him to what would normally be terrifying prospects. The letter's most powerful passages describe Heinrich's memories of home and his efforts to preserve these recollections against the psychological erosion caused by prolonged trauma. His descriptions of peacetime life become increasingly detailed and nostalgic as his present circumstances become more unbearable. I try to remember the smell of your kitchen on Sunday mornings, he writes to his mother. Coffee brewing, bread baking, the sound of you humming while you prepared breakfast for the family. These memories feel more real than anything happening around me now. Sometimes I can actually smell that coffee, and for a moment I forget where I am. Then reality returns, and the contrast is almost unbearable. The power of memory to provide psychological escape from present suffering appears throughout Heinrich's letter. His ability to access detailed sensory memories of home suggests that some aspects of his pre-war identity remained intact despite the physical and moral degradation of his current situation. Heinrich's letter also documents his growing concern about how his wartime experiences would affect his ability to return to civilian life, assuming he survived. His awareness of his own psychological damage reveals remarkable self-insight for someone under such extreme duress. I worry that I'm becoming someone you wouldn't recognize, he writes to his mother. The thoughts I have now, the things I've seen and done, how do you go back to being someone's son after experiencing this? How do you sit at a dinner table and make polite conversation when you know what human flesh smells like when it's cooking? I'm afraid that even if my body survives this war, the person you raised might already be dead. Heinrich's concerns about psychological contamination reflect genuine insights into how extreme trauma can alter personality and social functioning. His letter provides evidence that even soldiers lacking formal education in psychology could develop sophisticated understanding of their own mental health challenges. The document reveals Heinrich's attempts to preserve some record of his experience that might survive even if he did not. His decision to write the letter despite knowing it could never be mailed suggests a desire to bear witness that transcended personal communication with his family. I know you'll never read these words, he writes near the end of the letter. Mail service has stopped, and I'll probably be dead before it resumes. But I need to write them anyway, because someone should know what happened here. Someone should understand that we weren't just statistics in a military report, but real people who suffered and died far from home. Heinrich's commitment to documentation despite futility reveals the human need to create meaning from suffering through the act of testimony. His letter serves as evidence that bearing witness can provide psychological relief even when no audience exists to receive that testimony. The letter's final passages reveal Heinrich's acceptance of his likely death, combined with desperate hope that some trace of his experience might survive to inform future generations. His words become increasingly urgent as he attempts to compress a lifetime of reflection into what he knows may be his final communication. If someone finds this letter someday, he writes, know that we were more than the enemy soldiers you fought against. We were young men far from home, following orders we didn't fully understand, dying for causes that meant less to us than the simple desire to see our families again. Judge us if you must, but remember that war makes victims of everyone it touches, even those who seem to be its instruments. Heinrich's plea for understanding reflects his awareness that history would likely remember German soldiers at Stalingrad as aggressors rather than victims. His letter attempts to complicate simplistic narratives about guilt and innocence by revealing the human cost of military service for individual participants. The document concludes with Heinrich's return to the basic needs that dominated his daily existence: food, warmth, and human connection. His final words abandon abstract concerns about politics or ideology in favor of fundamental human desires. Mother, I dream about your kitchen table every night, he writes. I see myself sitting there as a child, watching you prepare meals with such care and love. You always made sure everyone had enough to eat, that no one left the table hungry. If I could have one wish, it would be to sit at that table again, to taste your bread and soup, to feel safe and fed and loved. That's all any of us really want in the end: to be warm, to be fed, to know that someone cares whether we live or die. Subscribe to ensure these forbidden stories don't disappear again. Heinrich Mueller's letter was discovered in 1991 during the opening of Soviet archives following the collapse of the USSR. It was found among thousands of documents related to the Battle of Stalingrad that had been classified for nearly 50 years. Soviet authorities had collected personal effects from German casualties and prisoners, using letters and diaries for intelligence purposes while keeping them secret from the public. Dr. Andreas Weber, the German historian who first examined Heinrich's letter, describes its impact. Reading his words was like hearing a voice from beyond the grave. This wasn't military history or political analysis. This was pure human testimony about experiences that defy comprehension. Heinrich's letter forces us to confront the individual human cost of what we usually discuss in terms of strategy and casualties. Authentication of the letter proved straightforward because Soviet record-keeping had preserved the circumstances of its discovery. Heinrich's body was found in a basement in the industrial district of Stalingrad on January 23, 1943, 3 days before the Sixth Army's final surrender. The letter was in his uniform pocket along with his identification tags and a small photograph of an elderly woman, presumably his mother. German genealogical research located Heinrich's surviving family members, who confirmed details from the letter and provided additional context about his background. Heinrich Mueller had worked as a bank clerk in Munich before the war, just as he described in his letter. He was drafted in 1940 and served in the initial invasion of France before being transferred to the Eastern Front in 1941. His nephew, Klaus Mueller, named after Heinrich's friend Klaus mentioned in the letter, provided family records that corroborated many of Heinrich's observations about his pre-war life. My grandfather never spoke about having a brother who died in the war, Klaus explained. The family was told that Heinrich died in combat defending German positions, but they never received details about the circumstances. Reading his actual words after all these years has been both illuminating and devastating. The letter's publication has contributed to evolving historical understanding of the Stalingrad siege and its human cost. Traditional military histories focused on strategy, tactics, and casualty figures while paying little attention to individual experiences of suffering and survival. Heinrich's testimony provides insights into how ordinary soldiers experienced events that historians had previously analyzed only from command perspectives. Soviet records from the siege, declassified in the 1990s, confirm many of Heinrich's observations about German military deterioration. NKVD reports document widespread cannibalism among German forces, collapse of discipline and unit cohesion, and massive casualties from starvation and disease. These official records lend credibility to Heinrich's personal testimony, while showing that his experiences were representative rather than exceptional. The psychological dimensions of extreme survival situations described in Heinrich's letter have attracted attention from modern researchers studying trauma and resilience. Military psychologists have used his testimony to better understand how soldiers cope with prolonged stress and deprivation in contemporary conflicts. Dr. Michael Thompson, a psychologist who specializes in combat stress, explains, Heinrich's letter provides detailed documentation of psychological adaptation to extreme conditions. His observations about changes in thought patterns, moral reasoning, and social behavior match what we see in modern studies of soldiers under severe duress. His testimony helps us understand both the limits of human adaptability and the mechanisms people use to preserve sanity in impossible circumstances. The letter has also influenced contemporary discussions about war crimes and moral responsibility in extreme situations. Heinrich's descriptions of cannibalism and other desperate survival behaviors raise complex questions about individual culpability for acts committed under conditions that compromise normal decision-making capacity. Legal scholars have debated whether extreme duress provides moral or legal justification for behaviors that would be criminal under normal circumstances. Heinrich's letter provides evidence of the psychological pressure that led to such behaviors while documenting the moral anguish experienced by participants. Professor Sarah Davis, who teaches military law, explains, Heinrich's testimony illustrates how extreme survival situations can create moral impossible choices where all available options involve some form of wrongdoing. His letter shows that participants often understood they were crossing ethical boundaries but felt they had no alternatives. These cases challenge traditional frameworks for assessing moral and legal responsibility. Educational institutions have incorporated Heinrich's letter into curricula dealing with World War II, military history, and human rights. His personal testimony helps students understand abstract historical concepts like total war and civilian military boundaries through concrete individual experience. Teachers report that Heinrich's letter generates more emotional engagement and critical thinking than traditional textbook accounts of the Battle of Stalingrad. His words help students understand warfare as a human rather than purely political or strategic phenomenon. The letter has also influenced artistic and cultural representations of the Stalingrad siege. Filmmakers, writers, and artists have drawn on Heinrich's testimony to create more authentic portrayals of individual suffering during the battle. His observations provide realistic details about daily life under siege conditions that were often missing from earlier cultural works. Documentary filmmakers have used Heinrich's letter as a primary source for projects exploring the human cost of the Eastern Front. His words provide emotional anchor points for historical narratives that might otherwise become overwhelmed by statistics and strategic analysis. The international reception of Heinrich's letter has varied according to national perspectives on World War II and German military history. Some audiences have embraced his testimony as evidence of universal human suffering during warfare. Others have criticized attention to German suffering as potentially minimizing Nazi responsibility for wartime atrocities. These debates reflect broader tensions about how societies remember and commemorate difficult histories. Heinrich's letter raises questions about whether individual suffering transcends political and moral judgments about the conflicts that create such suffering. German reactions to the letter have been particularly complex, given ongoing national conversations about wartime responsibility and historical memory. Some Germans have welcomed Heinrich's testimony as evidence that ordinary German soldiers were victims as well as perpetrators of wartime violence. Others argue that focusing on German suffering distracts from more important discussions about Nazi crimes and Holocaust responsibility. The letter has contributed to scholarly debates about the relationship between individual experience and collective responsibility during wartime. Heinrich's testimony illustrates how ordinary people become caught up in historical forces beyond their control while remaining morally accountable for their personal choices and actions. Russian responses to the letter have reflected complex attitudes toward former enemies and the legacy of Soviet victory in World War II. Some Russian historians have praised Heinrich's testimony as honest acknowledgement of German suffering that humanizes former enemies. Others have expressed concern that sympathy for German soldiers might undermine appreciation for Soviet sacrifice and victory. These varying national perspectives highlight how individual historical documents can become focal points for broader debates about memory, responsibility, and reconciliation between former enemies. Heinrich's letter serves as a reminder that personal testimony often complicates official historical narratives that emphasize clear distinctions between victims and perpetrators. The letter's preservation and eventual publication also raise important questions about archival responsibility and the ethics of historical documentation. Soviet authorities collected Heinrich's letter as intelligence material but kept it classified for decades, preventing its use for historical education or family notification. Archivists and historians debate whether governments have obligations to make captured personal documents available for historical research and family access. Heinrich's letter might have provided comfort to his relatives decades earlier if Soviet authorities had been willing to share it with German officials or international organizations. The delayed release of such materials reflects broader patterns of Cold War secrecy that prevented historical understanding and delayed family closure. Heinrich's case illustrates how political considerations often override humanitarian concerns in decisions about historical documentation. Contemporary archival practices have evolved partly in response to cases like Heinrich's letter. Many institutions now prioritize public access and family notification over indefinite classification, recognizing that personal documents serve important social functions beyond their intelligence value. The letter has inspired new approaches to military history that prioritize individual testimony over official records and command perspectives. Heinrich's words demonstrate the value of personal documents for understanding how ordinary participants experienced historical events. This shift toward social and cultural military history has revealed aspects of warfare that were often overlooked in traditional strategic and political analyses. Heinrich's letter illustrates how focusing on individual experiences can illuminate broader patterns of suffering and adaptation that affect entire populations during wartime. The document has also contributed to growing historical attention to ordinary German soldiers' experiences during World War II. For decades, scholarship focused primarily on Nazi leadership, Holocaust perpetration, and resistance movements while paying little attention to the experiences of rank-and-file military personnel. Heinrich's letter helps fill this gap by providing detailed testimony about how average soldiers experienced the war's progression from apparent victory to catastrophic defeat. His observations offer insights into military culture, social relationships, and individual psychology that complement existing knowledge about strategy and politics. The letter's impact extends beyond academic historical research to influence public understanding of warfare and its human costs. Heinrich's testimony helps contemporary audiences understand how quickly civilized people can be reduced to desperate survival behaviors under extreme conditions. This understanding has relevance for contemporary conflicts where civilian populations face siege conditions, displacement, and extreme deprivation. Heinrich's letter provides historical perspective on how people adapt to impossible circumstances while maintaining some aspects of their humanity. The document serves as a bridge between historical education and contemporary humanitarian concerns, illustrating how past suffering can inform present understanding of human resilience and vulnerability. Heinrich's words remind readers that extreme situations reveal both the worst and best aspects of human nature. His letter demonstrates that even under conditions that reduce people to animal-like behavior, some individuals retain capacity for moral reflection, compassion, and hope. Heinrich's ability to maintain concern for others while fighting for his own survival illustrates the persistence of human dignity even in dehumanizing circumstances. The letter's enduring power lies in its author's success in preserving his voice across the decades. Heinrich wrote hoping that someone would eventually understand what he and his comrades had experienced. His words have indeed reached audiences he could never have imagined, speaking to concerns about warfare and suffering that transcend his specific historical moment. Heinrich Mueller's final words return to the image that opens his letter. "Mother, we are eating horses now, and soon we'll be eating each other. But somehow, in my dreams, I'm still sitting at your table, still your son, still human. Maybe that's all that really matters in the end, not what we become when everything is taken from us, but what we remember about who we used to be." The letter ends abruptly, suggesting that Heinrich may have been interrupted while writing, or that he simply lacked the strength to continue. His unfinished words echo across the decades, carrying their burden of hunger, despair, and desperate love. Heinrich's voice speaks from the depths of human extremity, testifying to experiences that challenge every comfortable assumption about civilization and human nature. His letter serves as proof that some truths are too important to remain buried, some voices too urgent to be silenced by time or politics. In the end, hunger and letters both outlived the army that created them. Heinrich's words survived when the mighty Wehrmacht could not, preserving testimony that no amount of official history could capture or replace. His letter remains as evidence that individual human experience deserves to be remembered and honored, even when, especially when, that experience reveals humanity at its most vulnerable and desperate. Hunger and letters survive longer than armies.